And he looks right at me and he says, Mathew, you are a transitional character in your lineage.
And that is why I do what I do. Hi there, my name is Mathew Blades, podcast host and motivational speaker, and I love keynoting and putting on workshops to help people understand the value of self-care, because
there are people in this room that feel broken, but you're not. There is nothing wrong with you. Just like there was nothing wrong with me. I just needed to step into my life's purpose more, and that's what I want to encourage you to do.
Let's do this together. Head on over to learnfrompeoplewholiveit.com. I'd like you to consider for just a moment that more than half of the people who are listening to the sound of my voice will have a heart attack, stroke, or heart failure in their lifetime. However, research shows us that up to 90% of heart disease and stroke is preventable. I think about my own father, who died by heart attack at just 47 years old, and I wonder how much longer he'd be around if we'd just known about Health Span MD. Dr. Todd Hurst, a board-certified cardiologist, is not just my doctor. He's helped thousands of people just like you and me with his approach. Health Span MD is the way healthcare is supposed to be. An ongoing partnership between you and your expert healthcare team that guides you step by step on the best opportunities to achieve your health, weight, and longevity goals. Please take a minute and sign up for his 3-step consultation and witness the Health Span MD difference for yourself, so you can be here longer for your family and, most importantly, yourself. HealthSpanMD.com. HealthSpan MD, an insurance-based practice.
Find and learn from people who lived it wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from people who lived it.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
My name is Brenda Man-Fletcher, and I am 48 years old. I live in Sedona, Arizona, and I am here to talk about what it was like being a caregiver to my mother at the end of her life when she was experiencing Alzheimer's dementia, and just the process of preparing for end of life and, grieving the end. It's like a long goodbye.
Yeah, it is. Who do you hope hears your story today?
I hope that anyone who is either in the same circumstances where you're either witnessing a loved one who is at any portion of the timeline for a long goodbye, especially for Alzheimer's dementia, especially kind of going through the changes in your normal, somebody else's normal, and just how to take care of yourself, how to take care of the people that are sort of in your immediate vicinity, your loved ones. That's who I hope hears today.
Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. We'll get with Brenda in just a moment. Let me say hello to Dr. David Lykin up in the top right. How are you, sir?
Glad to be here as always.
Yeah, glad to have you, bud. He is somebody who specialized in trauma for many, many years, working very closely with the veteran community, and he is a psychiatrist. And so he'll be, I think, a real asset in this episode as we explore a couple of words that you just mentioned: Alzheimer's, dementia. It's my belief, and I don't have any scientific research behind me to say this, but those two words are going to be used more than ever in the next 20 or 30 years. There seems to be a lot of awakening in that space, and I witnessed it myself with my grandmother, who passed away due to complications of Alzheimer's and dementia. And we'll probably get to that story at some point here today in this podcast. But Brenda, you are joining us from lovely Sedona, Arizona. How are things this morning?
Cloudy, and it looks like it wants to snow, but it hasn't quite shown up for the snow yet. But it's always beautiful. Even when it storms, it's beautiful.
Yeah, you said something so fascinating to me, and I hadn't really considered that before, but you're right. When you lose somebody to Alzheimer's and dementia, it is this long goodbye. It's a long, drawn-out process. It's complicated. It's frustrating. It's got to be almost all of the emotions. And before we jump down that road, on our podcast, Brenda, I'd like to get people's first 10 years out of the way. And so can you give both Dr. David Lykin and I an idea of what your childhood was like?
Sure. Well, I was born into my biological family that raised me. I mean, it's funny to say that. We are Asian American. Both of my parents and my ancestors are Cantonese. And I grew up in my first 10 years where my father worked for a large corporation. So we were transferred around a lot. So I was born in Ohio. I spent a little time in Pennsylvania. We moved to Virginia, which was sort of a crazy place to be Asian American in the early 80s. And then I spent most of the rest of my youth outside of Philadelphia. But in those first 10 years, it's funny that you asked that. That's when we moved the most. So I have this funny story that I tell that I thought I had repeated kindergarten, so I thought like, I've repeated, but because I was in 2 different kindergartens and I was in like multiple preschools because they just my parents would move and they'd have to put me in another school. And so I believe that, when at some point my dad was like, I can't move anymore, I have to keep my child in one school and keep it stable. But Philadelphia was a nice place to grow up. It was very multicultural, and I made some, really, really close friends that I still have there. And then I eventually went to Penn State, got a degree, went to law school, got a degree there, and ended up flocking off to New Jersey to start a law career that didn't last very long, but it was very enriching.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
I had a military upbringing, and so we moved around a few times too. And I remember starting junior high at a new school. I remember starting senior high at a new school. And I don't remember loving that as a kid. But now that I look back on it, I'm pretty glad it happened to me because it brought out a side of me that inevitably helped me become pretty successful in my life. How do you look on those events in your life and all that moving around now as an adult?
Well, now that I'm a parent, I think I really have a greater appreciation of school systems and sort of the relationship of school systems and real estate, if you know what I'm talking about. Like, remember the days when like our parents used to move, if they moved, they would want to move here and get like maybe a smaller house because it had a better school system. And I remember my parents always being in that discussion amongst themselves. But now I live in a place where, like, if we were honest about Arizona schools, they're of a particular caliber. And so it's funny, I look at schools and I put my son the best where I can. And then just kind of hope that with other resources that he can learn where knowledge is and things like that. But I mean, in Virginia, it was like the public school system wasn't fantastic. So my parents actually bussed me off it was like an hour bus ride to get to a private school that was like Hogwarts. Or at least it felt that way, although maybe not as much fun, not with the magic. But I learned, I think that was where I learned how to learn, and then I took that with me wherever I went from there. So it was like, here I am, I'm a grown up now. And I kind of like, oh, you know what, that particular piece of work ethic I got from going to that school. And, how to make friends I got from going to this school. So, other kids that maybe only went to one elementary school, one middle school, one high school, they didn't really have that experience. You have the same set of kids from like maybe kindergarten through your senior year. And so for me, I have sort of these friends from childhood all over the place. And I didn't appreciate that when I was a kid, but I do now as an adult.
I want to ask you, Dr. Dave, because I'm sure working with the veteran community for as long as you did, there is a lot of that instability where people are having to move for jobs and relocate all the time. And what kinds of problems did people bring to you, or maybe not problems isn't the word, but situations did people bring to you where that created a source of soreness for them, be it anxiety or, just wondering if they're doing the right thing? And then what would you kind of say to those folks?
It's hard as a kid to move quite a bit. I guess if there's something good that comes out of it, it forces you to learn how to make friends.
Yeah.
You have to be out there and establish yourself with people quickly. It's probably easier now because people can keep in touch online. When we were all younger and phones were physically attached to the wall and there were no cell phones and no internet, I think it was probably tougher to keep in touch with friends out of state.
Yeah, that certainly was my truth. Was it yours too, Brenda?
Oh, yeah. No, I remember when we moved from Virginia back to Philadelphia, and I was allowed to have one phone call with my best friend per month, 3 minutes because of long distance. So my dad was like, you can call your best friend. You've got 3 minutes. And, we get on the phone and, you're in the 4th grade and you're like, hey, what's going on? And then 180
Done.
seconds later, my dad be like, done. Yeah. And that was hard. And there was letter writing, those were good days. But now, if my son's friend moves to Florida, they have, his one moved to Hawaii, and they text all the time. And I'm like, that's crazy. I would have loved that when I was your age.
My kids have that too. They've got a couple of friends that have moved away, but it's almost like they're still here because they game and they talk to each other that way. They're on social media, so they're connected that way. And there isn't that disconnect now with, like there was when we were growing up. What was your relationship like with your mom? Since we're going to spend a lot of time talking about her today, what was your relationship like with your mom growing up?
It was, to be honest, it was tumultuous. My mother was a stay-at-home mother at a time when, interestingly, I think a lot of the other mothers in my social circle were getting graduate degrees, and they were going out and they were working. And, she would, it was really important for her to be home for my father and myself. It was really important to her that there be like a hot dinner on the table every single night. And so, she would have friends and they'd be like, oh, you should go to grad school. You should go get a master's, or I think for her, she'd even need to finish a bachelor's. And she kind of really stuck to her guns that, she's like, you know what, maybe when Brenda is older, I'll go maybe do something. But I think it was also, there was a lot of heritage stuff in there. My grandmother had raised 8 children single-handedly. And those were the 8 that lived to adulthood. She had 2 that she lost when they were infancy or young childhood. And she ran her own business, and she bought a house before that was this is like Queens, New York. And all as an immigrant to this country. And so I think that my mother kind of had that, so that when she had married my father and they lived this very suburban life raising their one child, I was an only child, that really kind of affected her. But I was always aware that there was like this very, very prevalent unhappiness in my mother. There was, when I look back on it now, my mother just didn't get to live, a purpose beyond parenthood. And I'm not underestimating at all how purposeful parenthood is, but she, her creativity was she could make like amazing drapes. And, I'm sitting on like this blanket that you kind of can't see, but like she knitted this. And, whenever I have a guest to my home, they're like, that's an amazing blanket. I'm like, that was my mother. My mother did that. That was sort of like her genius. But like, she was always sort of unhappy. And then she was always angry. My mother had sort of this chronic anger. And that is something that in time, ironically, my father and I talk about this, that once the Alzheimer's and dementia set in, she had forgotten all the things that made her angry. So, in dementia, we actually got a more peaceful her where, she would kind of sit on the couch all day. There was, sort of a long marathon of television, but she was like, you would say, hey, Mom, how you doing? And she'd just be really pleasant and really kind of just have like this soft smile, and she'd respond to you, and she wouldn't know necessarily, she might or may not know who you were, but there was a peace and sort of a little joy maybe even. And we never had that with her pre-dementia.
I think we're so lucky to have a psychiatrist on the show with us this time around. Yeah. I know this isn't your specialty, Dave, but what's happening in the brain there for her to sort of set down all that resentment and all the things that she was carrying, and now all of a sudden, poof, like she isn't hanging on to that, and she is a different person. Help us understand what's going on there.
Yeah, I've worked with quite a few dementia patients, and usually working with dementia patients means working with the family. There's oftentimes not a whole lot that you're going to do with the patient per se. Especially as things advance, they don't really have a lot to say a lot of times. You're relying on the family to corroborate information and to let you know what's going on behind the scenes. So a lot of dementia work is family work. It's not so much working with the individual. And that's interesting that she became less aggressive. A lot of folks that I see, they become disinhibited. So if they're irritable or if they, think that they've lost something, it turns into confrontation a lot of times. So that's actually fortunate that it went that way. I've seen a lot of people with PTSD as they had developed dementia forget about the trauma. So I'm wondering maybe if that's kind of along the same vein, where the things that might have fueled the anger just kind of faded from existence, and so that wasn't a constant irritation anymore to kind of drive anger and aggression.
Is that how it felt to you, Brenda?
I think it really did. I mean, I think that my mother's childhood home, there was chaos. There was, I think, not that my grandmother was a neglectful person, but when you're trying to run a business and feed 9 mouths, there tends to be a lot more child raising responsibility put on the older children. And my mother was one of maybe the 3 younger children. Like, my mother had a lot of memories of just kind of being scolded a lot and being kind of yelled at. And then I know that before when my grandfather was still with the family, there was a point when he was no longer with the family and he was living sort of his own life someplace else, that I think that there was probably some violence, like, whether physical or emotional violence in the home. My mother was born in 1939. So this was sort of a time when you weren't going to family therapy or, anything like that, whatever traumas you were experiencing as a family and as a child and, whatever, it wasn't getting worked on or even necessarily identified. It was sort of everybody's normal. So,
yeah. You know what I want to point out to our audience that's consuming our podcast right now, something that we've kind of said a few different ways already today, which is our lineage sets up a lot of what's going to happen to us. And there's things that happen to your parents, that happen to their parents, that happen to their parents. And all of that stuff comes with them, and all of that stuff comes with you. And, Dave has this brilliant thing that he kind of talks about, which is when we experience trauma, it goes on our permanent record. And unless you kind of really learn to change the operating system, you kind of stay stuck in those patterns. And so that's so valuable to point out to people who seem to grow up in, as you said, like a house that felt chaotic. It's like, hey, consider for a moment that they're bringing all this stuff with them that their parents brought. And so, Dave, maybe you can help us understand a little bit more why that's such a hard thing to set down, why all of that baggage is so hard to set down.
Well, and as a kid, you don't appreciate that your parents had a life before you.
Right.
Like that they experienced things. They had dreams that never got fulfilled. They had, small t traumas that they were trying to work through. They were trying to, hustle a job and raise the kids and do all these things. As a kid born into a family, kids are very narcissistic in the sense that they only see what's right in front of them. They look to their parents as their caregivers and they expect to be taken care of, rightfully so. But the awareness of your parents having a life of their own really only sets in probably when you're in your 30s and older. It becomes kind of an awakening process. It's like, oh my gosh, like I'm living this now. I have my own kids. Like I understand now why dad was the way he was or why mom was the way she was, and it takes a while to make sense of that. And then to tie in sometimes quirky behavior that happens as the result of trauma, that's yet another higher level of processing, trying to understand that. And then for you as a child living in that environment to have adjusted to it and maybe handle things in a way that as an adult, it doesn't always get you where you want to be. And if you go through therapy and if you do some self-reflection and try to understand some of the patterns and then change them, that process takes time. And because we all work on autopilot. I mean, that's just how the brain is set up to work. You learn things a certain way when you're young, and then you just do them automatically unless you have some deliberate reason to change them. Well, if you learn it as a result of a trauma-filled environment, you continue to react to things in that way, be it avoidance due to anxiety or reacting in anger to things. so those patterns get laid down early, and you have to deliberately change them, or else they just persist.
Can I ask you, Brenda, if you are a different mother to your son than your mom was to you? And if so, what are those differences that you're trying to lean into?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And I think that it has, probably largely changed in the last several years. So like, my son is 14 years old, and I think I parented a certain way up till he was about 7 or 8. And then I was introduced through my Jungian-based therapist to a program called Love and Logic.
I love Love and Logic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the best. Do you know about this, Dave? Okay. One day we'll talk about it, but it's brilliant.
Yeah. And I wish I'd had it when he was a toddler.
Right.
And I didn't. So I just began from where I was. And then knowing that, I was going to eventually have a teenager, I started focusing on Love and Logic for teens. But it is empathetic parenting with logical consequences of action. So it's sort of like you almost want your child to kind of mess up a little bit while the price of that mess up is small, and they can learn, to make good choices. And I was not raised that way. That's an authoritative style of parenting, and I was raised in authoritarian parenting, and it was the way that my parents were raised, and it worked for my grandparents. If my grandparents, I think, may they all rest in peace, if they had ever heard, how I'm raising my child, that they would just kind of be like, oh my goodness. But I try to offer my son choices. We do a lot of, just talking about what, the possible outcomes are. I don't issue very many ultimatums. It's more like, well, if you were leaving all of your empty Coke cans, in the sink or around the house, then, and I think that we're probably not going to be getting any fresh Coke, cans or fresh soft drinks for a while. And then suddenly they all disappear. But, for me, like, I think I spent a lot of my childhood where I was sort of told, this is what you're going to do. Like, you're going to go to college, here are your choices of colleges. And, I remember, like, you have a choice. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be an engineer like dad. And so it's sort of like, I had a period of time where I was joking, gee, if web design had been a thing that I could have majored in, at Penn State in the 90s, I think I probably would have done that. But I look back and it never would have been an option for me to take home to my parents. Oh, I'm changing my major to web design, and my parents being like, exactly, what is that? And how are you going to make your living? And, but that was sort of the environment in which I grew up. And where with my son, like, we just have like a whole different relationship. I spent some time working with like attachment, and I worked with it with my therapist, where, I realized that I had sort of a chaotic, ambivalent attachment to my mother. I think that my mother was wonderful, and I think she did everything that she could, as a parent of like an infant and a toddler for me. She didn't have Google. She didn't have what to expect when you're expecting, any of all the stuff that we used as our Bibles. And so then I kind of realized, just kind of the ways that my son was responding to me when he was maybe in his toddler and lower elementary years. I was like, you know what? Like, I don't know what to do about this. And then I realized, I think I need to start with me, and I need to start looking at like what my attachment to my parents was. And it's amazing to think that you can go in and you can shift your attachment to your own child, and then that actually shifts your attachment to your parents when you're a grown-up and they're in their 70s and 80s. It was like my favorite. I was like a person that had found the perfect moisturizer, and I wanted everybody to like know about this. And but yeah, it totally changed my life. And I have to say that it made the last 7 years of my mother's life, my life with her, sweeter, because I felt the temperature, even though she was in dementia and I was helping to take care of her, helping my dad to take care of her. It was a more authentic attachment, a more authentic connection. And so, I could just bring care and she could just be her. And it was really a blessing.
You were talking about your mom having problems with anger, and when you started getting into Jungian therapy, realizing that you had an ambivalent relationship with your mom. if you think about it from a child development point of view, if your mom has problems with anger and you're a small child dependent on her, if you go to her for help and you're met with anger, that anger can be scary for a young child, right? And so what are you supposed to do? The person that you're supposed to go to for love and nurturance is also somebody who's frightening to you. So that kind of creates that ambivalence. And then trying to work through that as a small child with very limited resources kind of sets you up for whatever patterns then follow into adulthood. But then being able to resolve that, it's nice when you can send off a parent having resolved some of those conflicts, because leaving that ambivalence there when an adult parent, or obviously an adult parent, when a parent eventually passes away, that ambivalence then can be haunting afterwards. So it's nice to be able to work through that process and give them a good send off, and it's healing for you as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's true. You talk about this word attachment, and that's something that I'm familiar with because I studied Buddhism for many, many years. And so is that a central focus to Carl Jung too, is your attachment to things? Is that a Jungian, as you said, principle, or not really?
I have heard it in multiple places. I know people talk often about how Jung had such a focus on the mother. And it was both the mother as sort of the archetype of the mother, but also I think the mother as your first relationship. So, you have your first 9 months on the planet, technically, and, you're sharing a body with your mother. And I think when I first started working with a Jungian therapist, at the very, very end, it was like December of 2002, that I remember, I don't know, I was sitting on that couch for the very first time, and he might have asked me something along the lines of, what brings you here? And I talked about it. And I was saying, I always get to kind of this September fall period and I just get depressed. And he was like, well, it's funny. People often in that fall, autumn period of time, that is when, the child is leaving the mother for the first time to go to school. And it was the first time I'd ever really heard that before, except for a very, very stray, quick thought from my senior year creative writing teacher in high school, who was talking about, and then there's Jung and the mother. And it's so funny how you hear these little stray, things that people mention, and then later in your life, they become so prominent. But yeah, no, I do remember going back to what Dave was saying, that, certainly my relationship with anger that I had to completely shift in a way that was healthier really kind of came from seeing, my mother's anger for the first time, I think when I was a young child, maybe both of my parents, and being absolutely petrified, and not necessarily recognizing that for decades, but certainly working, doing whatever the work was necessary to the point that now I'm I get amazed when I'm like, wow, I can let myself have my anger and, feel it and do something really constructive with it and not feel as though my anger is going to harm or level someone else in my sphere. Cause that was a fear for a very long time.
Anger comes up a lot on our podcast, doesn't it, Dave? I mean, it seems to just always be there. And my feeling is that we're so accepting of it. We just sort of assume that people are going to be angry, and we tolerate anger. We tolerate violence. We seem to, is that what it is to you? Do you think, Dr. Dave, is we sort of tolerate it more than we tolerate other emotions?
I think there's an appropriate place for anger and an inappropriate place for anger. Many people have trouble setting boundaries. And so where anger comes in is when somebody's trespassing, when somebody crosses over a boundary, but you don't have the skills to set an appropriate limit with them. And so a lot of times incursions are tolerated, and that internal frustration builds and builds and builds. And if you're not used to setting appropriate limits with people, it builds to the point where you just lash out in anger. So that's kind of the inappropriate use of anger. But sometimes if it's a major violation, anger is the appropriate response to kind of set it right. but it is a force, and you have to learn how to use it. And you don't necessarily have to automatically react to it. So one of the best tools that I picked up as a therapist is the ability to kind of step outside, right? So you feel something, as a therapist, you're in a relationship with your patient that you're talking to, and sometimes it stirs up strong emotions in you. And instead of just automatically reacting to it like most people would, you have to take a step back and say, well, gee, I'm feeling really angry right now. Why is that? And do a little digging and try to figure out, is it something, is it a boundary violation? Is it something that's triggering a memory of a conflict that I had with a parent when I was younger? But you're not obligated to react just because you have a strong feeling. You can take a pause and take a step back and give yourself some space and look at what's going on and say, well, why am I feeling this way? This is, bending the needle pretty strongly. Why is that?
I want to ask you something, Brenda, that I dealt with myself, because I grew up in a house where there was a lot of anger and screaming and yelling and stuff too. And when I discovered Love and Logic and discovered that I did not want to kind of repeat those cycles in my home, I struggled as a parent sometimes because I would get angry, and rightfully so, at things that, as parents we should get angry about and they should bother us. But I almost had a hard time staying engaged with my kids because I was afraid to be angry around them, because I just didn't want that so much. Did you ever kind of walk that tightrope too and struggle a little bit with being angry and enforcing things when you, maybe in your gut, you knew it was the right thing to do? You just didn't, you were like, I don't want that ever again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, with Love and Logic, first of all, there's a certain amount of, there's a learning curve and there's a training. And the first time I came across it, I actually went the father and son that kind of do it, that they have the Love and Logic Institute. They did a program down in Phoenix. It was the kind of thing where you showed up at 8:00 in the morning, and then there was an hour for lunch, and you all got out at 4 p.m. And they sent you home. It was the room. I was actually one of the few parents who'd chosen to be there as a parent. Everybody else was a school teacher, and some schools had sent their entire departments,
Teachers, right.
Exactly. And it was wonderful to kind of see how both sets of techniques worked, but they sent you home with a couple of workbooks and some canned responses so that you could just get it started. So you left that room and you had your little empathy punchline where it's that is so sad.
Right.
About that, and you kind of had 3 little things that you could do. And then you kind of along the way find other people that are into Love and Logic, and they'll be like, I'll help you. If you need to do the thing where you have to say to your kids, we got to go do this thing. So you're going to need a babysitter. How are you going to pay for the babysitter? They'll I'll be your babysitter. I'll be I take toys for my payment or something like that. But it was really, really amazing. But I did have that thing where I got it down where I could do a 3-second explosion, where if I came in and just the living room was just looked like a nuclear meltdown, I'd be like, oh, and then I would get it together after 3 seconds and be like, well, what are you going to do about this? And I took that to my Jungian therapist, and she's like, you know what? It's really important for him to see that you're human. And it's really important. I mean, it's important for him to have the experience of the empathy, but it's also really important for him to realize this, angry mom is a possible consequence of you not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So it was helpful. And, 3 seconds is not an unusually abusive amount of time to experience your child to experience your temper. And then I always apologize for it afterward. And it became kind of like a joke. I'd be like, you know what? I was really, really tired. It's 8:30 at night, and that's not the best moment for me to experience, junk food and wrappers and stuff all over the living room couch. And if we can work together so that where all those things go, I think that 8:30 tired mom will come out a lot less. And he got it, and now it's a joke where if I kind of just see the room and I'm kind of And he's just like, I'm on it. I don't want to be angry mom. And yeah. And so that's sort of, I think, Love and Logic sort of at its finest. So.
Yeah, it is. Dave, you don't even know Love and Logic, and you're shaking your head like crazy over here. So you agree with some of this stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. A really important piece that you brought into this. People are going to lose their temper. Right. You're human. You're gonna get pissed off sometimes over things. The most important thing is when you do calm down to eventually go back and repair the relationship, because the message that you're trying to convey to your child is, I value you more than anything else in the world. What you did upset me, but I value my relationship and my connection with you, and going back after things calm down a bit and repair that relationship, that goes a long way toward helping kids to see a model of how to develop healthy relationships. And you're not denying anger, right? I mean, because that's a problem too. You have some people that they're so worried about becoming angry that they never express anger in any circumstances. Well, you know that they're angry. It may come out in passive aggressive behavior or other things later on, but you're being authentic and at the same time preserving the relationships.
Brenda, let me ask you a little bit about the first signs of Alzheimer's and dementia that you witnessed in your mom. And let's start to move into that space where it becomes, as you said in the beginning, that long goodbye. How old were you? What was happening in your life when maybe it's your dad who calls and he says, hey, something's going on here. Talk to us about those first few weeks, if you will.
Sure. Well, it was 2007 and it was the summer right before I was moving to Arizona from New Jersey. And my father, who was technically retired, he was consulting for his company. And so they had sent him on a business trip out of the country. And I was kind of wrapping things up where I lived in New Jersey. I went down to visit my mother, who was still living outside of Philadelphia. And we just kind of decided, hey, it's kind of our last hurrah. We'll be able to go to all our favorite restaurants and, watch our favorite little videos and things like that. And so I'm about to leave Philadelphia to go back up to New Jersey. My mom and I decided we want to go to one of our favorite restaurants. And I said, I'm just going to leave from there. So you drive and I will follow you in my car. And then we can just both leave from the restaurant. She's like, okay. So I'm following my mother. I had no reason to believe anything was really happening up until then. But I realized that driving kind of this 15-minute drive through the suburbs of Philadelphia, she didn't stop for a single stop sign. She didn't signal on a single turn. And then when we got to the parking lot, she was like, I don't know where my keys are. What did I do with my keys? I'm like, well, you got here. So, they must be someplace. And then so I went to look at her car and her keys were just sitting on the driver's seat in the car. And we were just lucky that the car was unlocked. We were lucky that when she got out of the car, she didn't press the button to lock the car. And I kind of looked at that and I was like, And I was kind of like, it could have been any couple of different things. She could have just been excited because we were going to do something that we loved and knew was fun. But when my father came home from the business trip and I got to talk to him, I said, you know what? You should probably look into this. I was 33, just about to go on 34 at the time, I think. I'm probably doing my math wrong. But, and my mother was right at about 70. And, I just said to him, if she's not going to stop for stop signs and she's, not going to signal and stuff like that, at some point she's going to get stopped for a moving violation, and it's going to not be good. So you probably want to think about whether you want her to drive, much longer. So that was 2007. And then 2008, almost a year later, my mother had a stroke. And that actually was the end of her driving. And she hadn't, to our knowledge, had any problems between that point in the summer of 2007 and the stroke in 2008. And when I look back, we were super, super lucky. But, at that stroke, my father actually stopped consulting and he remained home full time to kind of take care of her because she wasn't able to be on her own. So we were sort of fortunate with that. And then I think, honestly, we had there were various other things happening with her health, including she had a bout of cancer in 2010 for which she needed chemotherapy. And it became a whole hodgepodge of, is this Alzheimer's? Is this from that stroke? Or is this from the chemo brain that, you know, some of the doctors would, and the answer I think is probably it was all a mixture. But certainly, you know, the forgetfulness until the very end, I mean, until, you know, she passed away in October of 2022, only in those last few months did she not remember who I was. I mean, where I would find out that I would leave the house and she would look at my dad and be like, is that our daughter? And then my last conversation with her that I had in like October 9th, because I saw her October 9th, then I got COVID. So I was out for the amount of time that you have to deal with that. I did not know that October 9th would be my last conversation with her, because the next time I saw her, she had a brain bleed. And then when I saw her, she was unconscious in the hospital and she had not come out of that. But she looked at me and she was like, I don't know you. And I was sort of like, I'm your daughter. And she was like, what's your name? And I said, Brenda. And she was like, I love that name. And I was like, I know you do. And it was this really delightfully beautiful conversation that the universe just blessed me with. Excuse me. But yeah, when I look, you know, at your question about like, you know, how did it's like sometimes you're in the middle of it before you realize, wow, I think as a family, I think we're in Alzheimer's dementia. And again, we didn't have the anger. She remembered my son, like every single conversation we would have with her, she would say, is Elias in school? Or, you know, where is he? And it was only at the end where my parents had to watch my son while I had COVID. And when I got him back into my house, he was like, Grandma didn't remember who I was. Yeah. And I was like, you know what? Grandma has different kinds of remembering now. And I said, and when I see her, she always remembers who you are. I said, and when you are standing in front of her, you know, she's also blind now. So I think that she doesn't necessarily realize that you're you when you're standing there. But it's really interesting what they remember, you know, when they do remember. My mother like always remembers like this one story about avocados. And every time I would see her, like, and that story was from like high school, and she went to high school in the 50s. And I was just like, it's amazing. She remembers the same thing about the avocado sandwich. But she doesn't, you know, remember who her siblings are.
Did it break your heart? Did it break your dad's heart when she started? Like, I know you got emotional a few moments ago, but what did it feel like when your own mom didn't recognize you?
For me, the first time that it really maybe knocked the wind out of me a little bit, it was relatively recently. It was only maybe 2021. And I had gone to a local open air mall, and my car was parked in front of the Staples. And I noticed that my parents' car was parked in front of the Safeway. And I was like, wait, that's my parents' car. And I was like, oh, my mom is sitting in the car. So I just went up to say hello, to like knock on the window and be like, hey. And she looked at me through the window, and I could just tell she had absolutely no idea who I was. I was just sort of this very pleasant, friendly stranger that had decided to wave. And that was the first thing that I was like, ooh. My dad was really good with changes of memory. The thing that really started to level him at the very end, and we really only had a week to 2 weeks of dealing with this. So when I had COVID, we were talking on the phone. He'd given me a little update. He'd had to take her to the emergency room one evening because she'd fallen. But he said to me, I need you to know that I think Mom has forgotten how to swallow. He said, because I give her medications and she's chewing these pills. And he says, and these are really bitter pills. And so I said to him, I said, you know what? I think that we need to prepare ourselves that she's getting ready to bring it home. And then there was that. And then in that last week, he also found that he actually physically needed to feed her. She had forgotten how to use a fork or a spoon. And that was the one thing, when he describes it, that I think she was recognizing that something was really changing, because when he started to say, hey, would you like me to feed you? And he said that she just looked at him with such gratitude, like, I don't exactly know what's happening, but thank you for being here and helping me out with this. And
I'll tell you that I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast that my grandmother, eventually passes away from complications as well. And I love sharing the last few months of her life with people, because what I witnessed between my grandma and my grandpa was what I call the ultimate love story. We would be sitting in her kitchen, and she had the same 5 or 6 questions that she just kept asking every 20 or 30 minutes or so. How long have we lived in this house? What's his name again? Where do we live? And never one time did my grandpa ever get upset with her. He answered the questions in the same sweet tone every single time. And it was like the ultimate love story, because it would be so easy to just get so angry about that situation and just get frustrated about that. But never once did he allow himself to go down that road. And I thought, and I even said this at his funeral, a couple of years ago, I said, that's a kind of love that you just don't see much anymore, where we have that kind of tolerance and patience with people, because it has to be so frustrating and it has to just wear on you and break your heart and all of those things. I want to ask you maybe a really vulnerable question, and so pardon me right up front here, Brenda, but you mentioned that your mom was an angry person, and I can imagine that if you're anything like me, if you grow up with that kind of thing, you can kind of get a little angry back at them. She spent a lot of time like kind of hating your mom a little bit for some of the stuff that she did. And then how did you reconcile that when she gets dementia and Alzheimer's and she starts forgetting? You mind having a conversation around that?
Absolutely. I think that's where the Jungian comes in, where I didn't know what kind of relationship I had with my mother until probably I was right about 28 years old, 28, 29 years old. All I knew is that, I had friends that had these wonderful relationships with their mothers and their parents and stuff like that. And with mine, notoriously, anybody that I've ever lived with as like a college roommate or, like a former boyfriend, my best friend, something like that, all of them have these vivid negative memories of me on the phone with my mother. Like, I would have a phone call with her almost every day. She would call me maybe at my workplaces. And when I look back, I was like, oh my goodness, how unprofessional were those conversations where pretty much like the whole office could hear, whatever was going on. And I think when we talk about that chaotic childhood home that she had, that when you have so many people living under one roof, that the way that you think you can be heard is by raising your voice and getting louder. And that was really certainly my mother's experience. If she didn't feel heard or understood, which was most of the time, I think that volume just increased to a level of screaming. And so there was a lot of that. And then when I got to my first therapy, in 2002, 2003, it was just a lot of kind of shifting patterns of recognizing that, you don't have to communicate like that. You don't have to go through all of that effort and expend all of that very aggressive energy to be received or to communicate. But yeah, if you'd asked me in 2003, I remember kind of saying, I know one day my mother's going to pass away because that's, it's just a matter of whether I survive her or she survives me. But if I survive her, I know I'm going to be devastated. But some of it is not going to be about the grief of, oh, I loved my mother so much and she's gone now and I miss her. But I think what I knew that it was going to be is that she was the kind of person where, for me personally, I didn't know who I was going to get at each meeting, and who I was going to get could change in the course of the interaction. I could start, and it almost always started out sunny and generous and, playful sometimes. And then, there would be one thing that you would say, and then it would just turn into this tornado of an interaction. And then that was how, I moved to New Jersey in part to take a job, but in part because I knew that I needed at least about 2.5 hours of driving distance, in order to kind of try to make some sort of a healthy, whatever my life was going to be. And if I was going to build it, that it needed to have a little bit of distance there. And sometimes that was even really a struggle to maintain. I think that once I moved to Arizona, and my parents were a plane ride away, that is when sort of a lot of my deeper work started to begin. But yeah, that was something that I really noticed at the very end, and I was thankful for it. After she passed, I was like, I'm so thankful that I did all that work so that at the end I could give her a sacred send-off. And that with me sitting next to her bedside in the hospital, for my end, it was all love and all forgiveness. And I could feel that for wherever she was, it was all love and all forgiveness. And that is what I would wish for anybody. I mean, I wish that for anyone I know, all of my loved ones, just if you can get to a point where for every relationship that you have on the planet, that at the very end, you can give them a sacred send-off. I was reading her favorite book. We were playing Barbra Streisand in the room. And when the nursing staff would come in, you would have no idea that we weren't a lifelong harmonious family. And for that moment, it was 100% genuine, that any work that we had to do, it was in the package. And a lot of that work for me happened summer of 2022. I was, I kind of had found the right Jungian course in kind of working, Jung had a very big thing about alchemy, and it was sort of the different steps of working alchemy. And a lot of what came through for me in that course and working with dreams and working with imagery was related to my mother. And my partner kind of remembers that. He remembers me sitting there and working this one dream like it was my job. And yet when I look back, I was like, that was the dream that kind of broke me through, and that I could sit there. And when it was time for my mom to go, I was kind of like, what? This is the moment when I wish that I could just have her forever, and I know she's so physically uncomfortable and stuff like that, but I wish I could just freeze this moment and have it forever. And I never imagined that I would have it. In 2003, I would have been like, that's somebody else's, reality. That's probably not in the cards for me.
Dave, I want to spend a little time about this talking about doing the work, right, and getting yourself to that point, because what she's talking about there at the very end about nothing but love. I believe her, and I believe that there was nothing but love at the end. And so many times I think the opposite happens, where we harbor and hold on to the anger so hard and so fiercely, and we're so resentful and remorseful and all of the words, that even in death we can't make peace with right. that person. And then when they go, now you have all the time in the world to think about what you could have, should have done. And so give me your perspective on that, Dave, with regard to people and how they can come to a place of peace and love toward the end so that they can have that sacred send-off that she talks about. Yeah.
There's so many teaching points here.
I know.
First off, I'm a big believer in giving people a good send-off. We're all going to die at some point, and you have to come to the realization of that and kind of turn into the wind, turn your face into the wind and just embrace it and be present and deal with the sorrow, deal with the little moments of laughter, just embrace the entire thing and be there for that person, do the work and give them a good send off. I had that with my father-in-law. We had a very touching send-off for him as he was at the end stages of cancer. And you have to do the work. There's no way around that. When it comes to dementia, this is something that when I'm dealing with families early on with dementia, it's a gradual dawning of awareness of what's going on, unless there's something catastrophic that happens like a stroke and then they don't recover. Usually it's just slowly developing. And, at first you're kind of scratching your head saying, well, that's kind of weird that they did that. They lost their keys. Okay, well, they left the keys in the front door, what's going on? And then slowly things start to become aware. Where I see a lot of families struggle is they still expect their parent to be the person that they always had been, and especially if you have a parent that was a professional, somebody that was hard driving, and now they're becoming more dependent, and you can't trust them to make appropriate decisions, and you're having to step in and kind of be that guardian angel for them. There's a lot of conflict that goes around that. I see family members arguing with their parent over factual details, right? Oh, I have to go do this. I have to go that. No, you don't, Mom, just stay here. And they get frustrated. And the one thing that's pretty consistent that I've seen is, even though working memory is fading, right? They can't tell you what they had for breakfast. They can't remember where they were, a half hour before. They respond pretty readily to emotion, right? And so that part is mostly preserved. Sometimes there is depression that settles in, but family can get a lot done by deliberately maintaining a pleasant demeanor and being kindly toward them, because trying to turn the tables around. Imagine that you're trying to understand your environment, but there's pieces that are missing, and you don't know why they're missing, and you don't understand where you are right now. That generates anxiety, and then if you have this person in front of you who's angry toward you because you made a mess in the kitchen, or they found you rummaging through the closet for an hour, what are you doing in there? Why are you pulling all this stuff out? All they know is that there's a person in front of them who's being angry toward them right now, and that feels threatening, and they don't know how to respond to that. So my advice to family is, you have to put aside the conflict that you had with your parent from before, and realize they're in a different place right now. They're not responding the same way, and the roles are reversing. So they're becoming kind of like the child to you, and you have to treat them not childish, but childlike in terms of creating a safe environment for them, and instead of arguing about, well, no, you can't cook, you can't be trusted to leave the stove on, you just become the guardian angel and just make sure that hazards are removed and they just mysteriously go away. I think of a gentleman that I took care of one time, and his dad was developing dementia, and his dad wanted to go driving. And rather than get into a fight over, oh no, you can't have the keys, you can't, we can't trust you to drive. And what do you mean you can't trust me to drive? All they did was they took the plug wires out of the car, and they let him have the keys, and they let him go to the car, and they let him try to start the car. And they just watched from the window, and he tried a couple times, and the car wouldn't turn over. And then the son just very kindly went out and said, "Hey, Dad, what's going on? The car's not starting, huh? Well, it's getting kind of hot out here. Why don't we come in the house, and I'll call a mechanic, and we'll see if we can get that fixed for you." So you kind of allow them some level of autonomy, even though it's not productive. And then you're the guardian angel that comes in, and instead of having a fight over what they're doing or a fight over the details or the facts, you just kind of redirect them and say, let's go back inside. Let's see if we can get somebody on the phone and see if we can get that fixed for you. And then they forget about it, and then they're on to something else.
That's really sweet. That's really helpful, I think, too. And again, this podcast is all about tools, and that, to me, that's just another tool. You mentioned Carl Jung a lot so far in this podcast, and the fact that you've used his principles to help you kind of navigate your own life. Is there a tool or two that you could pass along to people, Brenda, that might be helpful for them, that you've picked up along the way? Maybe it's a principle, maybe it's a thought, maybe it's an idea. What have you picked up from, the Red Book or the Black Book or any of these other things that could be helpful for people?
I think sort of intuitively, the thing that comes to mind the most is just kind of starting a relationship with one's dreams, if they don't already. So like, There are a lot of people that'll be like, oh, I never remember my dreams. I've never remembered a dream. And yet I remember, my very first session, and I was leading it, and he was like, be mindful of your dreams. If you recall even any portion of them, you keep a little pen and paper by your bed and just write them down. And, so for over 20 years, I've been recording my dreams, and it's amazing what happens in your life. And it's not something that like you can kind of, put in an equation and draw a bottom line and be like, oh, here's the sum total, but just sort of like, just the quality of how you feel more clicked in, or more tethered when it's sort of like, I had this dream about, that I was drinking a cup of herbal tea and, my friend from childhood walked in, and yet like, none of that may ever happen. And yet just sort of keeping that in your head all day long, and just kind of moving where it moves. And then, Jung used to talk about synchronicities where, that's when sort of maybe you get like a message on Facebook from that childhood friend, and there's like no connection between those two things. And yet, for you, the connection is sort of like internal. But yeah, just kind of maybe just start, if you've never remembered a dream before, maybe just kind of put that pad and paper next to the bedside and be like, if I even remember that I had a dream about a flower, I'm going to write that down. I'm just going to start there and just kind of feel how nourishing that is. And then I think from there, like people usually, I think, come to him by one of his books. Like, they come across like Memories, Dreams, Reflections or something from a course in college or, whatever. And then it's always kind of just nice to start there with his version, his telling of his story.
Have you had dreams about your mom since her passing?
I thought I would have more. I've had one. Like before, when my mother was alive, I mean, there have been years of my life where like every single dream had some portion, something about my mother in it. But since she passed away, I had one, and it was like we're like in the house that we lived in Philadelphia, and we're going through. And then like I come to the living room and she's like laying on the couch, which my mother never, the couch was my father's domain. My mother had this chair that she sat in. And I looked at it, I was like, guys, you wouldn't believe this. I had this dream that mom passed away. And then that is what woke me up out of the dream. And it was this really lovely kind of goodbye.
To anybody who's paying attention to this podcast right now, they've come to us because of those two words, Alzheimer's, dementia. What could they learn from you, Brenda? If you were to sit down with somebody right now who's in the thick of it and they're just frustrated and they're all the things that come with it, what could you teach them?
I think going back to something that Dr. Dave was saying, the thing that pops to mind is, so I saw my father as sort of, if we had like a 60-40 split of the caretaking, where he was doing more like he was making sure she was fed, he was making sure she was getting her meds. And then if there was a messy moment, I would come in and I would help with the messy moment, because the messy moment was not a problem for me. And my dad, like, if anybody that has raised an infant or a toddler, they'll remember like the explosive diaper. Well, like a senior in Alzheimer's, dementia can also frequently have that moment. And I my dad would call, and it would be so hard, I think, for him to call me to kind of say, I need some help. And because he knew I had a teenager and, I might be, I said, no, I'm coming right now. And I would come over and I would just like, it was just like kind of stripping down the toddler. I would strip down my mother, put her in the shower, be talking to her. There would be some tension in the house, kind of getting that tension to kind of come down to baseline. And my dad would say later, my goodness, I'm so sorry you had to do it. I'm like, no, it's okay. I said, I went through this with, an infant toddler. This is easy for me. Like, you do the hard part. Like, please have me come in because I can do this part. And I can do it with a smile on my face. And I think that is something that I say to people, and they're like, oh my goodness, that's right. So I'm like, you know what, like when you were going into your mindset of dealing with those messy toddler moments that seemed like, oh my goodness, I cannot wait until they're like bathroom trained. It's like you're doing that in reverse with this person that you love. And yet like, we're not used to seeing our parents, or our older generation loved ones in that place where it almost seems as though they're completely losing their dignity. I'm like, no, they're just doing their life from, the peak of middle age down into the sunset. And that really, really helped me a lot. And it has really struck my dad. I mean, he'll still bring it up. He's like, my goodness, I don't even know how you did that. And I'm like, I just brought a different skill set because you never really had to take care of me in that way when I was an infant and a toddler. That was mom's realm, you know? And yeah, I joke also, you know, anybody that's had an infant, you've cupped your hand under somebody so that they could throw up into it because it was easier to wash your hands than clean the car, you know? And yeah. And so that I think is something, and you know, even if people hear that and they can have a little moment of lightness in being like, ooh, I can approach that moment of caregiving differently. I hope that that's something they can take away.
Yeah. And I think another point too is it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You know, as caregivers and as family members, you have to figure out how to maintain a pace that you can keep up for a long period of time without becoming burned out doing it. You know, the tough decision, you know, when it comes to whether or not to have a family member go into assisted living or a memory care facility, if you are not able, I mean, these facilities have staff turning over every 8 hours, right? You're just one person and you're on 24/7. Nobody can do that, you know? So if the family can all pitch in and kind of take on different roles and give people a break, give caregivers a break when they need it, you can maintain that pace for a longer period of time. I'm a big believer in having people stay at home as long as possible, as long as it's reasonable and possible, because you're surrounded by things that are familiar to you, and it's easier for family. But also, it's very jarring when you change the environment with somebody that has memory problems. You know, I've talked to people that took a family member on vacation out of state, and when they arrived at the new house, they really declined for a period of time because everything is new. And even though they can't necessarily articulate what's wrong, you just see that they're not functioning as well and they're becoming more confused.
I know that recently you started a little small art business that you're proud of. And I'm going to guess that a lot of this creativity has come from your life experiences. What can you share with us about your art business now and the motivation and what you're doing? And let's kind of close up shop with that.
Thank you. You know, it's funny because I had been sort of a creative art making child, but it was mostly pencil, you know, charcoal type of things. And I actually was enrolled in a course with a Jungian program that's out of South Africa. And it wasn't specifically an art course. It was to see like what kinds of creativity could come out in response to like their assignments and their prompts. And so I made this one painting, and then I took like kind of part 2 of that. And it was the host or the teacher. There was one sort of like more Jungian analytic host. And then there was an art teacher who is like a big art professor in South Africa named Cyril Kurtze. He did the official portrait of Nelson Mandela. And he was teaching this course on Zoom. And he would just give you little pointers. Like, you know, if you don't know where to start, take a pencil or a brush for a walk. And I was like, oh, that's really, really good. And one day I wasn't really even thinking I was going to do something that was responsive to the course assignments, but like I was listening to something else, and I'm like doing this painting, and it became something, you know. I mean, like they kind of they unveil themselves. And then I'd taken a picture of it and I sent it to my friend, and her mother immediately started measuring wall space and was like, could I get it in 24 by 36 and, you know, whatever. And I was like, so flattered. But then other people started to see it and they'd be like, I'd like to buy one. And then one day you wake up and you're just like, I have this art business that I had no idea that I was going to have, like at the beginning of the summer. And then suddenly, and then there was like this other thing that I wanted to do. Like I was on vacation in Santa Fe and I saw an Artomat machine, which if you haven't seen one, I look forward to the time that you see your first one. It's like an old cigarette vending machine that has been reconstituted by a gentleman in North Carolina to vend original art. And I was like, that's what I want to do. But to do it, it's like you need like 50 things. I mean, like you need to know how to like do stuff well. And then, you know, you need a website to catch the people. So, and then again, you know, it's the fall and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm at this art fair and people are buying my work. And actually my day of my first official art fair, And my day that my first meeting on the board of the C.G. Jung Foundation, which I was invited to, was the day that my mother had her final stroke. So it was sort of like Jung would have a lot to say about that. But yeah, so I have this little art business that I'm doing. I'm in a gallery now, and I make jewelry from my discarded prints. So I make this sustainable upcycled jewelry, and it has done so much to kind of help me find my way from one side of this transition to the other of it. And I'm just so thankful.
It's not lost on me, and it's probably not lost on Dr. Dave. You mentioned something early on, that your mom was never able to live out that creative side of her life. And in so many ways, it's almost this beautiful passing of the baton, where even you, who had to go to law school and do all these things that were expected of you, you have come to realize the value of creativity and the value of seeing these things through. And what better way to say, I love you, Mom, than to keep going in that space. Don't you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really beautiful when you think about it, how full circle that's come for you.
Thank you.
I really have enjoyed this conversation with you today, Brenda. Thank you so much for sharing this. And all of the best to you with regard to the art, but even more, thanks for helping other people just feel less alone and feel like, okay, they're going to get through this thing. Any final remarks from you, Dave, as we close up?
No. It's been a great conversation. Yeah.
Well said. All right, Brenda, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you both.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word, Learn from People Who Lived It.